let everybody know I'm Tracy Kurtzer. I'm in the Department of OBGYN at Northwestern. And hopefully everybody can see my screen there. And we're going to talk now, as Ted said, about extreme risk protection orders, otherwise known as ERPOs or ERPOs for short. And this photo on the left is actually a few firearms that were voluntarily removed from the homes of people who really no longer wanted them, but were uncertain about how to safely discard them. And this was from a gun buyback I organized in 2018 in Evanston, which is a city just north of Chicago. And what I realized when I spoke to a lot of the people coming in is that they recognized that having these weapons in their home was not safe. Maybe they had an elderly parent or a depressed teen, and they just didn't really know how to safely remove their firearms. And we know that in those situations, probably removing the firearm completely from the home is probably the safest of all options, but it's not realistic for all people. And so that's why we have these conversations about safe storage and try to meet people where they're at and with their needs. But for those, there are a few particular scenarios in which more extreme measures need to be taken to protect our patients or others' safety, and that's where ERPOs come in to play a role. And so what our ERPOs are, and I'm sorry about the screen, it looks like, at least on my image, our pictures are cutting off a little bit of the information, but basically, under current federal law, a person's prohibited from having a firearm if they fall into a few categories. And Ted covered kind of one of those with the mental health information, so I won't go into that, but those are people, who are agitated due to mental health conditions or illnesses. But also those who've been convicted of certain crimes, like all felonies and certain domestic violence misdemeanors, or those who are subject to a domestic violence restraining order while it is in effect. So those who may be still at risk might not be prohibited under current federal law. And that's why where the ERPO state laws really came in to kind of help fill the gap to cover those who might be at risk or who might be putting others at risk to get the time that they need to seek help. And ERPOs are basically civil court orders, and they are engaged in ways to temporarily remove firearms from people, again, who might pose a risk to themselves or others. So petitioners generally are going to be law enforcement officers, but in some states, family or household members are included, and that can include spouses or former spouses. Also, in some states, healthcare professionals can be petitioners for ERPO. Basically, what it calls for is revocation of the firearm owner ID card, and then in some cases, surrender of the firearms and ammunition. There are what are called ex parte orders in certain states, which are immediate removal. So a petitioner sends it to a judge, and if the judge feels there's enough evidence that this is an imminent threat to that individual or to somebody else, then they can issue an emergency order. And that order will last from anywhere from 1 to 21 days. And then that's followed by an actual court hearing. And in that court hearing, then a final decision is made, and it's an opportunity for the person who is the firearm owner or what's termed the respondent to present their case for why they should be able to keep their weapon if they feel like they should, and for the petitioner to present their case as to why they feel this is a danger for the person to have for a short period of time. And those orders then generally last for about 6 to 12 months. Again, the details of all of these very much are state dependent. And in the interest of time, I won't go through this. It'll be in your slides, but basically kind of the process that's involved. When there is a court hearing that is in favor for the petitioner, whether it's an ex parte or at the final order, the respondent must relinquish their firearm ID and firearms at that time. So there are a few high risk scenarios, as was mentioned by Ted, and obviously talking about ERPOs because it involves the legal system and it's involuntary. These are much more challenging discussions, I would say, having with patients, their families, or even sometimes in our own heads. But these are the kinds of scenarios we'll be covering. So the magnitude of the problem with suicide stats, I'm not going to reiterate these since we've gone over most of them, but again, just 90% of suicides by firearm are going to be lethal, and given that so many individuals, it is can be a very impulsive decision for some that they would never attempt to commit suicide again in the future. If we can have some interventions that allow safety for that individual, can make such a huge difference. And again, we know that suicides account for 60% of our national firearm deaths every year. I'm not going to go over the data of childhood risks since Kelly Henry covered that really well. But in a stable individual, let's talk about somebody that we're concerned about mental health concerns. You know, if somebody's not at acute risk, of course, discussions about safe storage or temporary transfer of the firearms for the family or the patient, if they're the owner, can be discussed first. And as Ted said, it's not a HIPAA violation also to speak to family members if you really feel that individual might be at risk for harm. So I mentioned the federal definition of who with mental illness is prohibited, and each state, of course, has their own rules. And if in the resources at the end that we'll provide for you, there is a link so that you can look up your own state's, indications for when mental health professionals or institutions do need to additionally notify the state, which then goes back into kind of the national database as far as restricting somebody from having firearm ownership. In many states, like my own in Illinois, law requires that hospitals or any healthcare centers that provide treatment for mental illness, that the professionals or the institution has to report any patient that's admitted for a mental health bed within 24 hours. But some states have more permissive regulations and some are not mandated at all. So it's really important to kind of know what's acceptable in your state. And in situations, though, where maybe criteria are not met for involuntary commitment or the patient's going to be treated as an outpatient, you know, this is where maybe a civil protective ERPO order could be considered in those who are refusing to voluntarily remove their firearms from access. So again, you don't have issues as far as HIPAA violations. If you feel that somebody is really an imminent threat to themselves or others, you can also report to law enforcement. And so if it's allowed for in your state as a healthcare professional, you certainly can become the petitioner. But I think most practically, we are generally talking to family, household members, or law enforcement to request these petitions on behalf of our patients. So the other high-risk situation is certainly domestic violence and other threats of violence. And I will cover these statistics just since they weren't covered in earlier talks, but just the prevalence of domestic violence is just so high. We know that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men experience severe physical violence in their lifetimes from intimate partners, and about 50 to 60% of all female homicide victims were actually killed by their intimate partner, with about 50% of the time a firearm being used. As with many other forms of interpersonal violence and community violence and gun violence, there's an intersectional nature to it. So we know that certainly certain groups are at higher risk, those from lower incomes, younger age, who live with disabilities, who are Black, Latinx, or Native American, Indigenous, or who identify from the LGBT community. Being threatened by a firearm in particular, but really any weapon, is actually a very strong predictor of future DV homicide for our patients. So we really need to listen to those threats seriously when we hear them from our patients and take them seriously. And then there's also often an unknown or not well-known connection between domestic violence and mass shootings. And now mass shootings, which were already mentioned, you know, they certainly make the news highlights, and basically it involves 4 or more individuals who are killed at a time, but they actually make up less than 1%, or about 1%, I should say, of our firearm homicides annually. But what was interestingly found in a review is that of national mass shootings from a 5-year period is that 59% were actually DV-related incidents. And we also know that 40% of male perpetrated domestic homicides result in multiple fatalities too. So those are the murder-suicides, maybe a child or another family member involved, maybe law enforcement response involved, or even Good Samaritans. And this just happened a week or two ago in Chicago, a Good Samaritan who intervened in a DV incident in the streets, who was shot by the perpetrator. And we also know that 80% of perpetrators actually make explicit threats or indicate intent prior to committing acts of public violence. So obviously, if we're hearing about that through a patient or from a patient, we really need to take those threats seriously. So again, if we have a patient who's a victim of domestic violence or a patient who's threatening violence, we should definitely do some interventions and counseling. And really at that point, often discussions about safe storage for obvious reasons are not going to really be the practical solution. Now, an adult involved in a DV situation can always apply for a domestic violence restraining order if available in their state. And some of those orders may also include provisions for revocation of the firearm RD and removal of the firearms. Or if the abusive partner already has a DV conviction, as I mentioned, or is under a restraining order, of course, they're not supposed to have any weapons. So law enforcement could certainly be notified in that situation to get a warrant for actual physical removal of the weapons from the home. And if none of these apply and a state ERPO law is in place, that's where a victim could potentially petition for firearm removal themselves. And I would say this would be particularly wise around the time of exit planning from a relationship, since that's a very high risk period, and domestic violence homicide goes up considerably during those weeks after extrication from abusive relationship. Now, in many states, as I mentioned, a concerned family or other household member, in addition to law enforcement, could also petition for the ERPO instead of a victim, or law enforcement if they're notified. And this may be the reason this is so nice to have in addition to domestic violence restraining orders is because that allows for someone other than the victim to be presenting the case in court. So it just eliminates that opportunity for the victim to be, further traumatized by having to go into a courtroom and present evidence against their perpetrator. And so, it gives a little option for protection that some victims of DV or survivors of DV may feel more comfortable with. Now, mandating reporting of domestic violence, as you all know, is not always required. However, if you really feel like your patient is being threatened, very imminent threat, or somebody they're talking about is threatening for public safety, if you feel like it's a credible threat, then you may be required by your state laws to notify law enforcement. And so again, it's really important to know your own state laws about mandated reporting of violence, including domestic violence. And I will also include the link to state laws in regards to those duty to warn regulations in the reference section afterwards. And again, what you can do in the states where you can petition as a healthcare professional, you can certainly take that on. But again, most often we're going to be discussing these orders with our patients or potentially family members or law enforcement directly. And then last is the issue of impaired cognition and access. And again, I won't belabor the stats here because I think most of them were covered already, but I do want to say that firearms are used by more patients who have dementia as their utilization or their method of suicide as compared to really all other ages or groups. And 11% of caregivers had concerns about their family member or the person they were caring for having access to the firearms. About half of them had already done something about that. But about almost half of caregivers also really felt that healthcare providers should be involved in having these discussions of firearm safety with our patients. And so ideally, again, as Kelly mentioned, is if we can involve our patients early on in those discussions, kind of part of early safety, including firearms and advanced directives before the cognitive decline is too great, that is ideal, but definitely whenever it's applicable. Again, family members could certainly be called upon and petition for an ERPO if the impacted owner is really unwilling or unable to make decisions about safe storage or voluntary relinquishment. And, patients, I would say, that are potentially of higher concern are those who are maybe starting to have issues with memory or facial recognition, certainly those who are maybe having aggressive or threatening language or behaviors in our patients with dementia. So again, duty to warn laws. If you have serious concerns about imminent threat, you can review your state laws in regards to that. And again, if you are able to, you can petition as a healthcare professional yourself, or reach out to family or law enforcement. So what are some important things to keep in mind when we're having those clinical encounters? And we'll practice some of these, but I think, here are a few guidelines to work with when you're talking to either your patient or your family member. I think, first, treating our patients with the respect they deserve and sensitivity. We know these are tough discussions to have. And also, no matter what our personal feelings are about firearms, the goal of counseling is to hopefully educate our patients and make some changes in their lives that might save their life or somebody else's. And having these conversations on firearm safety planning, again, especially if it's part of kind of an advanced early directive tool, was actually found to be really well received by older patients, and that included 54% of firearm owners, and it included veterans who are firearm owners as well. But I think the first step is definitely present the problem, like what is your actual concern here, and then providing a little background education to the patient or the family. And then, as Dorothy mentioned, I think really universalizing this discussion is so helpful. Saying things like, some gun owners who have suicidal thoughts consider making their guns less accessible for a period of time until they're feeling safer. Are you a gun owner? Is that something you'd be interested in discussing with me? And I think that really shows you have no judgment about them being a gun owner or a family member of a gun owner. But the next step is, really emphasizing again the harm reduction and safety aspects of what you are recommending. Having other examples like how we restrict other things, other lethal weapons like driving, maybe if we're having, vision issues or on certain medications or in post-operative states, right? That's all about kind of personal and public safety. So making those comparisons can be helpful. And many older adults are particularly receptive to that conversation, especially if there's other high-risk individuals in the home. So if there is a child or a teen, they may be even more open to having discussions, even if it's also for themselves. And stressing the preventative aspects again. So DV situations, always counseling can be a bit trickier, and it's just so important to discuss these potential interventions without demonizing the perpetrator. Often these relationships are very complex. There can still be tremendous bonding and patient minimization of potential harm despite the levels of abuse they might be suffering from. But you certainly don't want to create a defensive patient where they're feeling like they have to stand up or defend their partner. So in those cases, stressing how the behavior exhibited by the abuser is harmful and not the person, I think, is the best initial approach. And then, of course, you can kind of mirror your own patients' feelings and their language about the abuse or abuser as you get more feedback from them. If it's hard for the patient to see the risk to themselves, again, emphasizing others who might be at risk, children or other family members in the home, or those who might be innocent bystanders, and just really how it's no different from other safety measures that we take to protect our families, like removing things around the home that might be a risk for the kids. The other important thing is to really stress the language that reinforces this is considered a temporary hold. So we want to avoid saying things like taking away or surrendering firearms, instead saying things like holding for safekeeping until such and such, improves, and focusing again on the situation itself as being high risk, not the person necessarily. The patient is not the problem, but the condition that's putting them at risk is. So the approach and intervention one takes, of course, is going to depend on all the risk factors, the individual's ability to actually collaborate, the nature of the access, whether it's their own firearm or somebody else's, of course. But as much as possible, if we can try to find patient-centered solutions. And, for patients who are dealing with serious mental health or cognitive issues or decline, their ability to make the best decision for themselves or others might truly be, quite impacted. And we do really need to step up in those situations. On the other side, I think in domestic violence situations, again, a little bit more complex, the patients generally do know their situations best as to the risks for themselves or their family if they proceeded with something, an intervention like an ERPO. So I think we're really there more to educate and provide the resources primarily, and then hopefully encourage our patients to work with the domestic violence agency because they can really help with coordinating efforts like a domestic violence restraining order or a extreme risk protection order, and they can work with them at the ideal timing and scenario to really try to make it as safe a situation as possible. So do ERPOs actually work? Well, there's actually not a whole lot of data out there, but some of the data certainly looks very promising. We know, for example, that in domestic violence restraining orders in which firearm restrictions are included in states, that there was a 10% reduction in domestic violence homicides compared to states that don't have those, don't have the ability to remove firearms in those situations. And in states that do have firearm restrictions in those situations, if there were particular provisions like having the ex parte order, there was actually a 12 to 13% reduction even further in domestic violence related homicide. In the situation of mass shootings in California, there was a study done that showed that in 21 cases where their ERPO, which is known as the gun violence restraining order, was issued, afterwards there were 0 post-order events that were identified. And then in regards to suicide, in Connecticut, researchers estimated that about 10 to 20 restraining orders were necessary in order to reduce one suicide. But in Indiana, in 10 years following introduction of the extreme risk protection order that they have there, they saw a 7.5% reduction in firearm suicides. So I think it does make a difference. And just key points for us to remember is just to be very careful to have our own biases, racial biases, gender biases, cis, trans, homo, hetero biases, all of those when we're making these decisions to have these discussions. We don't want to either over or under utilize them in particular groups of people. We really want to focus on the risk for that individual patient. And then again, HIPAA really makes it clear that our professional judgment is very much respected when it comes to issues about our patient safety and public safety as well. So currently, just in the last year, we had about 5,000 petitions filed across the country. And that's good. We're still getting more and more states are signing on. And as of April of this year, 19 states had extreme risk protection orders in place, and including DC. And in 13 of those states, family or household members can also petition. In a few states, healthcare workers or educators or school administrators can also be petitioners. At the federal level, interestingly, 85% of likely voters really favored Congress passing a federal ERPO law. And our representative, Lucy Macbeth, who's one of our Moms Demand Action representatives, comes from a background of being a survivor herself, actually introduced act this past year. So as physicians, if we don't have ERPOs in our state, we can certainly be a voice for having them included in our state laws. If we're in states that have them, like mine, I'm a voice for always improving it. Our FRO, firearm restraining order, was updated this last year, and including different petitioners and including ammunition. So there's always ways that they can be improved at the state level as well to get involved. So our Justice Department actually has issued a model extreme risk protection order And that resource will be available to you as all. So if your state does not have one, you can use that to try to encourage a lawmaker to take it on. So you, again, will all have access to my slides and references to the resources. And I do want to reiterate what was said earlier, which is we know this is just one component. Gun violence is such a complex issue, and there's many different factors involved. And as physicians, I think on the ethical side, we also, who care about this as a public health crisis, we really also need to support communities that have been chronically underinvested and underserved. And those are ways we can use our voices and our titles as well. So funding for violence intervention programs, mental health services, and other approaches to reduce poverty are really critical in our efforts across the board to reduce gun deaths and injuries. But what we can do in the office as we're sitting across the patient, we've given some suggestions for you for how to take this back and utilize it. And last, I just wanted to share a message from a survivor friend of mine who lost her sister to gun violence. And her sister's death, if you read about it in the news or saw where it happened on the south side of Chicago, I think many people would have assumed this was secondary to, gang-related or community violence. But there really was a deeper story as to why she was killed. And so I taped her talking about this, but unfortunately the taping was so soft. So I just kind of synopsized it here for us. And her name is Celia Colon. So her sister was actually killed just about a year ago now. It's coming up on the year anniversary. And she was a victim of domestic violence for years and years and had been going through emergency rooms multiple times with some really atrocious traumatic injuries. And Celia really said, she feels like her death could have been prevented, that she died at a very early age, but I think it could have been prevented. And when I asked her if she thought that if firearms removed from abusers, like through domestic violence or emergency risk protective orders, could save a domestic violence victim's life, she's without hesitation said absolutely. So her plea to us today was just to spend that extra 5 minutes, just step it up a bit to talk to our patients, to ask and be willing to provide preventative counseling for our patients who are dealing with violence. And so our next set of counseling sessions will be on, taking that 5 and or 10 minutes, I should say, to learn how to do that.